today we're going to continue kind of working our way through this book that Making Zen Your Own by Janet Jiryu Abels, that gives us kind of a social historical perspective on the development of Zen through various Zen teachers, from Bodhidharma up to the present day. And if you have the book, I hope you're reading it and enjoying it. I find it really very interesting from a lot of different standpoints, and particularly what I'm finding interesting about this point in Zen history is to see the development of Zen as a discrete tradition within the myriad streams of Buddhist practice and thought. So, and it's beginning to gel for me. And I must say, I had only the most very superficial understanding of how this process developed. And, you know, I think history, the historical perspective is so interesting because there's always going to be a new interpretation of history, and a new effort to understand what happened, why it happened, when it happened. And of course, so now we read certain words about, about the let's say these words, development of Chan Buddhism in China. And that those whatever 5 or 6 words express centuries, and not just centuries, but years, not just years, but months, not just months, but days, not just days, but minutes, moment by moment, all converging to create a stream that has meaning. And so this is part of that, I think. So the person that she chose to discuss in this chapter, it's interesting because actually she chose to talk about the teacher called Guishan Ling Yu, who lived from 771 to 853. But actually the chapter is mostly about his teacher, Bai Shang, I think it is, Bai Zhang. So I'll be talking a little bit about both of them. And so Guishan, which is his ultimate Dharma name when he became the abbot of a monastery on Mount Gui, was born into a time of great flourishing of Buddhism in China, and there were some 5,000 monasteries at the time. And monks often traveled between monasteries. Sometimes they would study for a period of time with one teacher and then move on to another one. And so there was a lot of cross-fertilization and refining of fine points and so forth. And of course, opinions about what was right and how things should be done. And some of the encounters with by these traveling monks with various teachers were recorded in stories that persisted throughout the ages and were later written down and preserved. And these stories often showed the depth of understanding that arose in the teacher-student encounters. And some of them became part of classic collections of koans that were formulated as I said, in later centuries. And so in this cross-fertilization of thousands of monks and thousands of masters and thousands of points of view and teachings, a few influential figures stood out as teachers that have had a distinct impact on the formation of Chan, which became Zen in Japan and became distinct from other monastic approaches. So you probably remember that the word Chan later transliterated as Zen in Japan, is a transliteration of the word jhana, the Sanskrit word jhana, which means meditation. So this emphasis that Bodhidharma brought to China um, is still meditation. It's not meditation only in this era, but it's practice. It's Buddhist practice and understanding based in meditation. So Guishan, as I said, lived in the 8th to the 9th century, and he left home and began his study at the age of 15 in a nearby monastery. In this monastery, the practice emphasized the vijnana, which is a long set of rules based on moral precepts which govern the life of Buddhist monks and nuns. And there are various Vinaya schools, but that had also developed over a long period of time. But it was thought by even by the various schools that it was based on the original monastic rule as promulgated by the Buddha in order to regulate the behavior of his disciples when they gathered together during the monsoon period. And this monastic rule applied to both male and female monastics. And all of the later recordings and the earliest recordings of the Vinaya, although it was in effect for centuries before, are actually in the fifth century. And they comprise of some 300 plus rules, with 8 extra rules for women. And in the Vinaya schools, these sets of rules were taught and learned and recited regularly, so that the monastics would understand what they were required to do. And it was a very strict and detailed moral code regulating every aspect of monastic life. Maybe not unlike, say, for example, Judaic law, telling monks what to do and what not to do at every moment. And Guishan studied there until he was about 23, when he left to study at a different monastery with an abbot who had studied with a teacher that we have studied in the Zen lineage called Matsu. You probably remember him. So he was free to go, whether, maybe was he released from his Vinaya master? Did he decide that he needed something different? What exactly happened is not known, but it's clear that at that time, Buddhism was very, very fluid and alive and vital. And I'll read you a quote from Abel's book. And at this time, lines among Buddhist schools remained quite blurry. In many respects, there were still different teachings more than different sects. Movement among the country's 5,000 Buddhist monasteries and temples was quite free, and as students and lecturers circulated, they carried texts, ideas, metaphors, teaching methods, and the like, creating an active exchange among diverse traditions, maybe not unlike what's happening in 21st century America. And so this new monastery and teacher differed from Vinaya in that by this time, the multiplicity of Vinaya rules in some monasteries had been distilled in the Chan, the developing Chan monasteries to 16 precepts for living. The precepts that we now know as the 16 that we commit to when we ordain, beginning with the lay ordination ceremony known as Jukai. And we have been studying the 10 clear mind precepts, which are the ones that are a bit more specific about offering a lens for evaluating motive and behavior. One of the emperors during that period of time had decreed that all Buddhist monks and nuns had to be registered with the government, and different Buddhist groups began to define and differentiate themselves from each other. Guishan's new teacher, Baizhang, formulated a particular set of monastic rules known as the Baizhang Zen monastic regulations. And this set of rules, which included the 10 precepts the 16 precepts that I talked about, have had a great influence on Zen practice to this day. Baizhang discarded parts of the Vinaya that were not relevant for Chinese life and replaced them with practical rules. And here are some of the rules that he instituted, which you will probably recognize as part of what we now do. For example, the monks were now to live in the same space in which they meditated, not in separate buildings. And meditation platforms were built along the sides of the monks' hall with a place for personal belongings. This new kind of physical space must have reinforced the primacy of meditation in a very tangible way. Now, we don't live in a residential setting, but for example, sometimes when students from the U.S. have traveled to a temple or monastery in Japan, you eat, sleep, and meditate on the same cushions. So it's definitely something that's still done and understood in current Zen practice. Monks' seniority was established not according to their social status, but according to their length of time at the monastery, which was certainly a blow to the hierarchy and its privileges, always the kind of iconoclasticism that has been in Buddhism from the beginning. And then building upon the one-on-one exchanges between Matsu and his students, monks now regularly went to have private meetings with the master in his room. And we perpetuate that with our practices of practice discussion and private meetings with the teacher. The community gathered in the morning and evening to hear the Dharma talk, and then in a new development, engage the master in debate. So I invite you to do that. But one of the most important changes became institutionalized as the role of work in Zen monasteries in practice. And as you know, Buddhist monks in India following the Vinaya had been forbidden from manual labor, actually, especially farming. A strict interpretation of the first precept, the precept of not killing, had prohibited farm labor for its killing of animals and even insects. And this sin was left to lay people to commit. So slaves, prisoners, and indentured farmers performed the labor to produce food for the monasteries. But Baizhang didn't agree with this practice. And others also changed their practice with regard to this because they realized that they were just passing the buck for the responsibility of killing to eat. Or the other thought is that there was perhaps a shortage in a source of labor in some of the more remote monasteries that Zen teachers seem to gravitate to. In any case, work now became an integral aspect of the Chan monastic life. Everyone in the community had to work equally. Baizhang's most famous teaching was, "A way without work is a day without food." I think I said a way without work, but it's a day without work is a day without food. But it's not simply a practice out of necessity. Work and attention, complete attention to each moment of function in life became part of this activity. The concentration and insight of meditation must be brought to bear in how we function, how we act. And I think this is a profound aspect of the way of Zen. And I'm going to read you another quote. When we just function, just act, just work, with no idea of a me or I, that is functioning or acting or working. The Dharma is fully expressed, and then there is no separation between form and emptiness. So work practice periods are part of all meditation retreats, and helping practitioners to live and function in the world with a still mind. So it's not that we separate the still mind of meditation from activity, but we merge them. So here's another quote from Guishan: "Work and home chores are the way." I love this because being able to activate that as a layperson has been one of the most important aspects of practice to me. It's been an entry gate for me in a lot of ways. Guishan studied with Baizhang for many years and eventually became his Dharma heir and succeeded him as abbot. He had worked, meditated, and studied at Baizhang's monastery for many years as head cook, fully putting into practice the expression of realization in work and service to others. And later, he expressed his own teaching like this: "When thoughts are exhausted, you've arrived at the source where true nature is revealed as eternally abiding. In that place, there is no difference between affairs, the world, and principle, the source, and the true Buddha is manifested." After his teacher died, Guishan moved to another monastery, maybe founded his own monastery and on Mount Gui, and taught for about 40 years, and it became a sought-after Chan master and had 41 Dharma successors. I realize this talk is too long, so I'm going to skip over a little bit. But one of the things that he said to one of his successors was, "When you deeply know your faults and suffering, then you can encourage each other to persevere with your practice. Make a vow that for the next 100 eons and 1,000 lives, you will everywhere be spiritual companions to each other, always and everywhere." So I first started practicing Zen in 1998, and I was still practicing Catholic at that time. I had met Grace and through a professional exchange, and she had been recently ordained. I'd met her before she was ordained, and then after she was ordained, she had formed a meditation group that met on Sunday mornings in the loft of her barn in North Fork, which is about 15 miles from here, and which is where Al and Linda now live. And I had, as a Catholic, I had found that I was seeking something more, I guess I should say. And I'd articulated to myself two wishes for a spiritual life that I hadn't been able to previously find. I wanted a way to live a deeply spiritual life as a layperson, and I sought a non-cognitive approach to the divine. And in the traditional Catholicism of my childhood, if you wanted to live a holy life, you became a priest or a nun. And as a female, I couldn't become a priest. Not that I'm sure I would have wanted to, but it was barred to me. And I was not interested in leading a celibate life as a nun. And of course, also there are few models for living a spiritual life as a layperson. The vast majority of saints that you try to emulate were not lay people. And so there were, few lives models for the spiritual life as an ordinary person. And also, Catholic Christianity is highly theological and highly intellectual. And it values the intellect and reasoning, which we now see from the Zen standpoint as cognitive processes, limited cognitive processes. But Catholicism values the intellect as the highest and most godly of all human capacities, thinking of God as pure intellect. But I'd read about Christian mystics, particularly the female Christian mystics, and I thought that there was something that they knew that was outside of the realm of dogma. But I didn't know how to get there. Interestingly, my spiritual director, who was a Catholic priest, suggested meditation. And I said, I can't sit still that long. But I started to try. I had attended a meditation retreat with Pema Chodron, a Tibetan traditional teacher, at the suggestion of a high school classmate of mine. And I couldn't find a group that she was affiliated with in Fresno. I attended a couple of Vipassana groups and so forth, but then I met Grace, and who became a qualified Zen priest, and I was hooked. Because Zen seemed to offer me what I was looking for, a way of life and a way to be connected to a divine source that wasn't limited by dogma. And I was intrigued by the mystery and the aesthetic and the exotic quality of Zen, and the simplicity and the rigor. I became Tenzo. I didn't know that I was following in Guishan's footsteps, but being Tenzo was a wonderful way to merge meditation and action. So it's been very interesting to me to reflect on the historical development of this and to consider some of these Zen aspects and how they developed and why. For instance, there are a lot of things that we do. I was thinking about this in relating to our sewing practice, that we sew our own robes, and the concentration and effort that it takes, the commitment that it takes to do that, and the value of doing that. It's not just sewing a garment, but it's sewing the whole practice into something that you actually put on and wear and live out. So ordinary life becomes holy in itself. So each of us receives the teaching of the Buddha and expresses it in our own way. If we're lucky, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. If we're lucky, we pull it into ourselves ever more deeply and fully. And then unwittingly, as the ancient ancestors did, some as teachers and some as practitioners, we carry forward our experience and understanding and teaching, and the teaching of our Dharma ancestors. Our minds are meaning-making machines, and we make meaning out of what we experience. And then we live it out, and our life is communicated. Our life in itself becomes communicated to others. So I invite you to reflect yourself. how has Zen entered your life? Not so much as an intellectual understanding, but in action, as living, as function. Because it's this way that we carry forward the Dharma into a new generation.